Just in time for Halloween, let's talk about Mythlords Classic Monsters, a deck builder that brings classic monsters to the table. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald. In this episode, we're going to talk about a a monster-themed deck building game that was sent to me recently by the folks at Destiny Horizons. This is a game called Mythlords Classic Monsters. It's a game for between 2 and 5 players. It works for people aged 13 and older, and games take an hour to an hour and a half, maybe as many as 2 hours, depending on the number of players in the game. Let's take a deeper look at Mythlords Classic Monsters from Destiny Horizons. Mythlords is a medium weight deck builder. It's not too complicated. If you're familiar with deck builders, there's lots of mechanics that are going to carry over from a traditional deck builder to this one. This one does have some extra wrinkles. So even though it's medium and the rules are pretty straightforward, my group certainly had to wrap their head around the combat part and how power is calculated and then how damage is allocated in a battle. So we'll talk about that when we get to the area control part of the game, because that's the other piece of this puzzle. It is a game where you're trying to be the player who gets to 20 points. 20 points is the victory condition. You earn points by controlling areas and by defeating other players' monsters. Another way that the game can end is if one player's sanctum, their home base, is critically damaged 3 times through players attacking them. So after the third one, the game's going to end. You're going to look at who has the most points. So it is a game that's all about earning victory points, and 20 is the cutoff. It's a little bit asymmetric. You're going to start by choosing a faction, and there are different classic monsters. You've got Frankenstein's monster is in there. There's a werewolf, and of course there's Dracula. That's my favorite of the monsters in the game. The preview that I have came with an expansion that includes a witch and some characters from the Wizard of Oz, so you can have the Dark Oz expansion. Allows you to bring out some Oz-themed monsters also. But it is, in some ways, like I said, a traditional deck building game. You'll start by choosing that faction. Each faction has a commander and a small deck of starting cards, like every deck builder. What's nice about this one is that the starting deck does include a minion, so one other character that you can deploy if you manage to draw them. So now you've got 2 monsters that can act on the board and try to control these different areas or engage in combat. The factions are a little asymmetric, so the commanders all have different abilities. Many of the cards in the starting decks are pretty much the same, other than the minions, but your commander gives you certain powers that you can activate. And the minions have varying abilities as well. Of course, the game is going to become increasingly asymmetric as you buy cards and build up your deck. This is, of course, a prototype, so I'm showing you some pieces that might change. And I know one of the things that I've seen are some 3D models. They're going to have some miniatures of some of these creatures in the game as well. Now, typically you'd have standees, color-coded standees based on the player color. That makes it very easy to tell who's who and who owns which monster. And when the monsters stand up, it is, of course, easier to tell what's going on each location. Unfortunately, the prototype that I was sent didn't include those. I think that it got forgotten somewhere along the way. So I don't have the color-coded standees, but those do exist, and they will exist when the game comes out. And then you've got potentially those miniatures. At the beginning of each of your turns is the influence placement phase. So if you managed on the last turn to place one of your monsters on a location and they didn't get kicked off in combat, this is part of the area control part of the game. You're going to place an influence token. Of course, Dracula has fangs that he's going to be placing on these different locations. And then that if you manage to get 3 influence accumulated on a particular location, then you claim it. Then the next thing that happens is your sanctum is going to generate power. Power is a very important resource in the game. It's used to affect your combat strength. The power is used to buy cards as well, or to activate some of the card abilities they have a power cost. So once you've generated your power, you start playing those cards from your hand. That's going to probably allow you to generate more power. as you go through the game. Maybe it's going to allow you to draw some cards as well, and then you continually play those. Then you spend the power on cards that are in the river, so that you've got a nice big stack of cards here, and there's going to be several of them, I think 5, in the river as you play the game. Once you've bought all of your cards, then you can start deploying and moving your monsters around the board. So if you're going to deploy a monster, it's going to go down here underneath. That monster card goes under here unless they're in your sanctum protecting it. And then you'll have a standee for each of the monsters that you've bought from the river, from the marketplace. You can move a couple every turn, and then these are the figures that are going to be claiming those locations and allowing you to generate the influence at the start of your next turn. Combat starts if you deploy or move a monster onto a location that's already occupied by another player's figure. All the locations actually have a limit to how many monsters can be on them. So that's an interesting wrinkle, because if you have a vehicle that allows you to transport, say, 3 monsters, you can load up the space and nobody can battle you for supremacy in that spot. But if you do wind up in a battle, there's a few things that you're going to get to do. You can start by playing some cards to adjust your power here to maybe reduce the other player's combat strength or increase your own. You're also going to bid power. So hopefully you've saved some power and you didn't spend it all on cards that you bought if you're going to go into combat, because then you're going to turn this dial secretly and decide how much you want to add to your combat total in order to determine who wins the game. Once you've done all of those calculations and both players have revealed their combat dial, you figure out who the winner is. The highest total is going to be the winner, and then you start allocating damage. So if Frankenstein's monster has done 5 damage, say, to my brides over here, the Dracula's brides, then I'm going to look at their health and see, oh, they only had 3 health, so they're going to be defeated. They're going to go into my discard pile. So they don't get removed from the game entirely. They go back to your discard pile. You can deploy them again on a later turn if you manage to draw them. You could win the battle and still your monster could take so much damage that the monster is defeated anyway. And you could rescue that monster if you want to by using some of your sanctum health. You can spend the amount of health that would get you back up to +1 health so that your monster gets to stay on the location and generate influence on the next turn. This is where things were a little bit complicated for my group. How much do I want to spend? How do I allocate that damage? What am I doing here with these? It took a while to calculate out the battles. And you're also playing cards in that battle. So it's 2 players going against each other typically, and each one thinking about what card they want to play, then trying to figure out all of the abilities and what your total combat strength is in addition to how much you've bid, uh, and then you have to allocate the damage afterwards. So the combat did take a little while and kind of grinded along as you played the game. If you manage to win and you've got a character that has at least 1 health, or you've rescued the character so it has at least 1 health, everything resets. So you're not keeping track of hit points that are lost over one turn to the next. If this guy survives with 1 health or 2 health, then they're back up to full if they get attacked again later on. And that's the game. You just go around. You're drawing your cards, you're playing your cards, you're buying cards, and then you're engaging in these battles at 3 different locations at a time. There are these missions you could also place your monsters on. The missions will give you some extra ability or bonus if you're able to keep a monster on there for a couple of turns, although other players can fight you for control of the mission and knock you off of that card. So there's a lot going on in this game for sure. This is where, that medium weight complexity kind of comes in, because you're really, one of your resources is the power, of course, that you're spending, but the other resource is how many monsters do you have and where are you going to put them? You need to guard your sanctum. You need to maybe accomplish a mission that you're trying to work on, and then you're looking at all of these locations and whether other characters are going to earn victory points on their next turn. What skills, though, are you practicing when you play a game like Mythlords Classic Monsters? This is a game with a lot of strategic planning. All of these, well, many of these cards have some ability, so combining certain monsters together is going to maybe be more efficient or more effective in combat. You're managing a lot of things and trying to earn enough resources to get the cards that you want and build up your deck. At the same time, you don't want your deck to be just filled with a whole bunch of cards that are you're going to need to cycle through before you can shuffle those discards back in again. So you are doing that planning, you are doing that budgeting, and anytime you're doing budgeting and planning and you're working towards a goal, I mean, that is exactly the executive functioning skills, the skills and behaviors that you need for goal directed action. You're trying to figure out the steps that you need to accomplish that goal and then carry them out as efficiently and effectively as possible. You also need to be able to adapt on the fly. So there's a bit of fluid reasoning or flexible problem solving. You're generating the strategy and the steps to carry it out, but as other players start moving their monsters around, you're going to have to adjust your plans in order to adapt to whatever it is that they're doing. So there's flexible reasoning as well. You've got those executive functions, like every strategy game does invoke the executive functioning skills because of the planning that's required and the strategy. But fluid reasoning is also involved here when you're trying to kind of adjust that strategy as the parameters of the game change. Final thoughts about Mythlords classic monsters. Well, first of all, the artwork. Oh my goodness. Mark Spears is the artist on these, and I really, really thought the artwork was great. Thematic. It's got sort of the old, maybe Boris Karloff style Dracula here. The monsters are classic. It's like you're reading those classic horror comic books. Great artwork. And it is a thematic game where you're combining. I'm not the biggest fan of deck building games, but you are combining that deck building mechanism with the area control, so it really turns it into a different beast. The fact that once you've got these cards, that the monsters that you're deploying, then you've got to move them around, and then the combat starts. It reminded me a bit actually of a mobile game, a really good mobile game, honestly. Marvel Snap is what I'm thinking of, because you've got the three locations and you're deploying not the cards, you're keeping the cards on your side, but in Snap, you and your opponent are deploying cards to compete for control of a particular location. And this sort of reminded me of that. You've got the three different locations where battles can happen, and you're placing your cards here and there, and you can upgrade your cards, and cards combine together in order to add to your power. So it did remind me, it had that feeling of that great game. And it is, I mean, it does combine, it's not doing anything new in terms of the deck building, other than you've got the asymmetric commanders and minions, but then it's combining those monsters that you can put out onto the board. And with the standees, I'm not sure how the miniatures are going to compete with the standees that have the card art on them. I really quite like that. Another thing I thought was cool about this game is that in this giant deck of cards, there are two copies of these monsters, but of course you can only have one unique monster on the table at a time. So if you've got, say, a nun that's deployed, I might have a card that I can't play if I've got another copy of that nun. But if that nun gets defeated and knocked off the table, now I can deploy my copy of the card. I get this little standee, and the other player can't use their card. So it's not really a take that kind of a mechanism, but you can, if you've got a copy of a card, knock that player's monster out, even if you don't wind up winning the battle at that location, you can knock the monster out and then put yours into play on your next turn so that the other player can't play their copy of it. There are a nice sized number of locations here, and you're only seeing three at a time as the players are collecting them. You've got that option of attacking the sanctum as well. That's going to earn you some victory points as you put influence on the sanctum by doing that critical damage if you can, if you manage to do that. That was a hard part. Mostly when we played the game, we were competing for the locations, and that's how defeating monsters and earning the locations was how we were getting our victory points. So, I mean, this was a fun combination of area control, resource management, and deck building. Are there downsides though? Well, the downside for us was that the combat did kind of bog things down. It wasn't as fast paced as we wanted it to be, and I think that was because my play group wasn't very familiar with these kinds of games. They hadn't played a lot of these sorts of card games before, where you're adding up the power and the combos can affect that, and that's going to influence your final strength at the end of the day. And then the idea that you can win a battle but still have your characters defeated was a bit of a there was some cognitive dissonance there, you might say, with my play group. But yeah, I think that it gets calculating that power and figuring out the battles can bog things down, especially if you've got new players who aren't familiar with these kinds of games. So that's the complexity can um, it's a positive, of course, because it's strategic complexity that we're talking about, but the negative is that it can be overwhelming and slow things down. But we had what a great Halloween game. We had a good time playing this game. I love the artwork on these cards, and the classic monsters are a lot of fun, especially at Halloween time. So thanks so much to the folks at Destiny Horizons for sending this game my way. I will put information about the crowdfunding campaign in the show notes below the video. But if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section below, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and the previous ones are already up there. Brains on Games is the X handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.